Playtest RPG, I'm Jonathan Albin. This is Gamemaster's Toolbox, and today we're going to be doing something we haven't done before, and that is a review of a new product. Today was the release date for Daggerheart, and the local game store had asked me in particular to run a preview session of it for this particular day, and so I've got my first thoughts. There may be other game masters who have already done their reviews of Daggerheart, and I have to be perfectly candid. I got my first look literally yesterday, and we did the demo today. So before we get started, go down below and click all the buttons to let the algorithm know that you're part of our audience, and let's get started.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Alrighty, so thank you for being with us today. This is Game Master's Toolbox, and we will be reviewing the brand new game Daggerheart. I don't have all of the particulars, and I am not doing this as a professional review. Other than as a professional game master, I do have my take on it, which we will be providing throughout this. We're going to review the topics. We're going to talk about the product itself, its pluses and minuses, and my personal interpretation of it. Just to be very clear, this is unsolicited, which means there's no revenue associated with this at all. My presentation of this is simply for awareness about a new property that's come into the public eye, and to give my take on it as a game master with 50 years of game mastery experience. So, first question is, what's the appeal? What is it about Daggerheart that draws attention? Well, the most clear answer is not the monsters. Wrong button. Not the monsters, it's the appeal. It is definitely not a game that is set up specifically to promote anything other than the critical roles approach, and therefore the game is designed specifically for that purpose. And right off the get-go, I have to say it is a game that is specifically designed for that purpose and seems to suit that purpose pretty effectively. Now we're going to be going into the details of how it particularly works and what in particular you as a game master will need to know about it before you decide whether or not you want to play a game or design or run games of it. Alright, so the initial overview of Daggerheart is that it is a roleplay game. It is built specifically to focus on the theatrics of roleplay and specifically to embrace the concepts that we see in Critical Role's mechanism. There are definitely pieces of it that feel directly stripped from the show, and there are certainly pieces of it that feature heavily into the very concepts of putting together the story, the elements of play that you would see in the television program. So it is optimally exactly what it intends to be. And as we go through these individual other elements, I do want to say that one of the major benefits of the Daggerheart system is that it promotes heavily the concept of the game master's story-driven process. So right off the get-go, it's already meeting me halfway in terms of what it is purporting to be, and that is the development of a story through a direct, heavily influenced game master's role. There's a whole lot more to it than that, so we'll go into those pieces, but just realize that we are looking at a game that is focusing exactly where you would think that I particularly would want to go with it, but there's more to it than that. As far as the resources provided, I have to be honest that I did not receive access to the information until yesterday. From what I was told, they were supposed to provide the information a couple of weeks in advance, but that was not the case. Now, I do not know what the holdup was. I don't know what the mechanism was, and I don't mean to disparage that, other than as a game master, I generally need more than a 1 day run up to running a brand new system. So, despite that, let's just specifically say that the resources were ample for their purpose. As a mechanism, the game's focus does seem to be very, very much on the roleplay aspect and the theater of the mind mechanism. There were resources that were provided that I was not able to take advantage of simply because of the short run-up time. So we'll deal with that in another episode, and I'm not particularly speaking to the direct process. I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong with the materials. It's just that I was not provided them with any amount of lead-up time, which would have made the experience perhaps a little bit more visually acceptable to the players. As far as the independence of the game compared to other properties, it is definitely not a situation where it is a cookie cutter of other mechanisms. So the very play mechanism of the game is rather independent in terms of its approach. This feeds very well into the game master's ability to monitor and alter the process. There is a mechanism that requires kind of the yin-yang of the game to ebb and flow, and it was of stark contrast to note that there were problematic descriptions within the narrative, and we'll go into that a little bit later, but the game's independence and its interconnection with other systems was scant, and it was actually if you will, an understandable departure from role-playing as you may have found it in other mechanisms, and is well suited to the concept of game master monitoring and control. The depth of its innovation perhaps lies directly on the, if you will, the nerve center of the game, which is the concept of there are 2 dice that you roll in the game, 2 d12s, which by themselves individually the dice are not problematic. The number that is generated between 2 and 24 is a reasonable alteration, with the idea also that the doubling of the dice, so 2s, 4s, 8s, any pair of numbers being a positive thing, tends to overlay the limitations of such a wide range of numbers in order to create the ambiance that the game looks for. Adding to that, this concept of the duality between hope and fear really does give a nice ebb and flow feel to the game, as the fear, the number of times that you roll fear and increase the ratcheting of the game is pretty much mitigated by the fact that when there is a hope roll, the players get the ability to trigger some of their effects. And this merger between the two concepts really does give a innovation to the feel of the game. It front loads the curve somewhat, so you feel the game moving towards the dark side with 1 or 2 or 3 fear rolls. You're driving up the tension level, but then at the same fashion, the rolls of hope tend to lessen that, and its modification, even though it's arbitrary, it's set upon the die rolls, it does give a better feel to the game mechanism because the story makes sense, because the pressures rise and fall more stably than they might in a regular role-play mechanism. As far as systemic balance throughout, there are issues, of course, with only a first session awareness and only having the ability to play pre-generated characters. There's not a lot to be understood about the equality of the balance, but I will say that the pre-game, the setup for the initial game does seem to be fairly balanced. It does look like they've taken some time to build out the personas for that initial conflict. It's interesting that they built specifically around a specific character and said that one character must be played and then all of the others are add-ons. But this also lends itself to the very mechanism of a game like Daggerheart that's going to focus on the game master and the story of a particular type. I'm not certain in terms of the overall game because this is only my first time playing it, but the feel of it does seem that there are mechanisms that mitigate the advances that some person may have and limit perhaps the advances they might otherwise take. And again, because it's only within a prepared module, I really can't tell you specifically more than that. It does seem that there might be the mechanisms for balance, but I can't specify what those might specifically be. It does seem like the concept of the class structure and the race structure are pretty much hardwired, and so whether or not you can mix and match is yet to be known. Now, the rollout of this game really does depend heavily on an understanding of the lore, and that is perhaps a problem when it comes to running the module. If you do not, as I do not, have the access to the lore of the setup for Daggerheart, it's kind of jarring to mitigate to players, to identify to players what they can or cannot do in reference to the lore. What it's possible that they know is much broader than what is actually known about them. So this is, at least at first blush, a problem for the module. And I'm not wanting to make any aspersions because I don't know much about it, but the access to the lore does seem to be somewhat problematic, especially it being a first blush run through. Now, get this, as a game master with as much as I have experience, I get the idea that the information that you are providing to your GMs must be restricted, but this does lead to places where literally the game master doesn't know what's possible and what's probable, and that can lead to problems after release. Now, because of this, because of the restrictions that are made in terms of what the characters can and can't know, it does lend itself to problems of player agency. The players may want to pursue information. For example, the lead character is associated with the very concept of being a sorcerer, and yet there's very little that provides them with mechanisms to what they can or cannot know. The very abilities that persona has includes being a royal mage, but there's no specificity, wow, that's a word, about what they have as their capable knowledge. They are stated to be aware of a lot of things, but there's no mechanism for expressing that, and therefore it makes the character feel somewhat flatter than it might have otherwise. There are also a considerable number of forced contrivances, and I get that in a preset module, you are wanting to make sure that the players get to experience all of the gamut of possibilities they might run into. And the challenge with that is that the game master is then, it's dependent upon the game master to build out the story so that the pieces make sense, and that sort of puts on the game master a level of authority that, at least in the meta game environment, is problematic. In an actual game, the game master certainly can be the one to say, I'm the authority on the subject and make these rolls. But the idea of doing so literally hard-coded into the module does lend itself to the game master feeling like he's not prepared to run the module in its depth. This was only a fleeting issue, and so we were able to get past it in the actual encounter itself, and a lot of it we were able to whitewash in terms of dealing with the mechanism. because we could see what was trying to be done, but the mechanism itself was somewhat faulty in describing. It almost felt like the module in some ways might have been either underfinished or rushed through editing to get to the table, because there were at least a couple of places in the mechanisms where what was described went against the very earlier mention of rules. So we'll leave that as it is. It just made for some very difficult contrivances during the session. Of course, when you are running any game, especially with a brand new group, you're going to have some of these playtest eventualities. A new player walked in who hadn't been planned for. We had extra players who were only able to observe and not participate because there weren't enough characters provided for the group. Now, generally, a group of 4 or 5 players is optimal. In my case, I had 6 and 7 players that were on the site at any given time. And so it was problematic because those that couldn't play were only observing the outcome. And therefore, they certainly had things to be said in the game, but that were not part of the story. And these kind of eventualities, you really can't hold the particular module to. So I'm basically going to bypass or handwave that portion, because playtest games or pre-release release games are release games, and that's just the way it has to be. As far as the game overall, it's a very game master heavy mechanism, and this is obvious if you look at the property that it is intended to support. Matt Mercer does an amazing job as game master and has to keep his hands on everything that is involved in the story. Now, this is problematic when it comes to Daggerheart, because there are a lot of game masters who are not at his caliber or not at his level of acuity, and so there are a lot of burdens that are put on game masters in this experience, in my experience with this game, that are problematic in the long term, because the game master simply is required to make up the distance, so to speak, between what the players know and what the players are capable of. That means he has to have a real understanding of their limitations and be able to roll with the punches of their own interaction with the characters, and thereby he has to be as familiar with the characters that are being played as the players do, and that can be a problem. Now, in the term of an hour and a half long module, it's, again, not problematic, but in the longer scale, if the game master is required to carry the burdens, I can see this being a problem for the property in the long term. Having said that, I do want to close out on a much more positive note. My professional opinion is that Daggerheart is itself a role-playing mechanism that will have a particularly narrow niche of game masters who will appreciate it. Having said that, it is a functional system. There are places and hitches and glitches that may have only been because of my lack of understanding about the system, but there is also a what appeared to be a glaring hole in the mechanism dealing with the actual combat. I won't go into any more detail than that, because the playtest was my first experience with it. And so, having said that, it was a bit of a shock, but I would say that Daggerheart is definitely a playable mechanism, and I hope you have a great time with it. If you would give your comments, let me know what you think of Daggerheart and of its particular utility in the role-playing environment. I will bring more information as I get to it. We will be running another playtest of it on Saturday. So if you're in the local area in Southern California and want to be a part of our group, you can hop into Board Game Paradise, 109 West State Street in Redlands, California. It's right downtown. And we're there starting at 2 p.m. and running until 6 p.m. Pacific time. And I hope to see you there. If not, I will catch you in the next episode. And as always, go play.